welcome everyone to really what is becoming a tradition here at Mount Cross to have these Sunday afternoon health forums. And I'm so glad you're all here. I suspect, I do not know, but if you are like most people, including myself, you love someone who has or has a mental illness. Or you are a person who has or has had a mental illness. And part of the good work of the church is to make sure that that is not stigmatized. God has come that we may have abundant life. And we are all about taking care of each other. And one of the ways we do that is by making sure we have good information and good resources for support. So I could not be more thrilled than to introduce to you one of my colleagues, an Episcopal priest and a registered social worker, the Reverend Alene Langdell Campbell. She'll tell you a little bit about her journey, but she's a local resource. She lives in Oxnard, and she cares, you can tell, because she's both an ordained Christian leader and a certified mental health professional. She cares that the church be a place where we talk about, can share our struggles with, and can find healing and support for mental illness. So if you have questions, you have pink. Are they all pink, Susan? No, you have note cards. You were given them, or they're somewhere in your pews. Sometimes a question will come to you in the middle of the presentation. Write it down. Sometimes you may have a question that you just don't feel like raising your hand and asking on the microphone. Write those questions down. If you run out of note cards, raise your hand, and the care team will make sure you have note cards. Alene's presentation will be about an hour, and then we're going to leave time for question and answer. So no question is off limits here. So please welcome with me the Reverend Alene Langdell Campbell.
I'll let you take that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today on this important topic. So as we get started, I wanted to start just a little bit with how I ended up here in front. So as Pastor Julie said, I am an Episcopal priest. I spent about 7 years serving as a religious service volunteer as a priest in the youth correctional facility here in Camarillo. And out of that, I began to realize more and more that I had a lot to offer as a priest. There was a lot about the mental illnesses I was seeing I did not understand. I was working on the mental health unit. I was working on the behavioral treatment program. And there was a lot that I needed to know. So I went back to school and got a master's in social work. And I finished up my master's right as the pandemic got started. And I went to work at an adult day healthcare center. Spent a little over a year and a half there, and then moved over to Seneca Family of Agencies, which does crisis care for teenagers. So a little bit on both ends of the spectrum here. And that's where I come in today, because all through that journey, I also knew that I didn't want to be a priest over here and a social worker over here. That we, as Pastor Julie said, in the church have to get better at destigmatizing, at welcoming, at understanding who it is that is in our pews, right? And not requiring people to leave parts of themselves outside. So here we are. This is part of my dream in all of this, is to bring these two pieces of my life together in a way that is hopefully life-giving to the church. So when Pastor Julie and the health team here started talking about this, they proposed the topic of mental health through the ages, and I went, wow, okay, we're going to get that done in an hour. Okay, let's see. So we are going to skim over mental health through the ages and touch on a lot of different points. But we are not going to delve, so that's where your note cards come in. If there's an area that you really wanted me to go into more depth, by all means put it on a note card. If I don't know the answer, I probably know where to help you find it. All right? Fair enough? So mental health is a description both of how our brains are working and how we're functioning in our environment. Change can occur in our biology, our thought processes, or our environment, our relationships, our work, our community, say a pandemic. For this reason, one of the best ways to monitor our mental health is to see how we're functioning in all the different areas of our life. Are we noticing changes in eating or sleeping that's affecting us in negative ways? Has work or school become more difficult? Is our family life peaceful or full of conflict? Do we have active friendships that feel positive and supportive? Does our spiritual life support us, motivate us, make us more anxious? So you may recognize in that description that what looks healthy and normal is going to differ depending on one's developmental age and accompanying activities. So let me give an example. Let's say I have a client who's presenting with angry outbursts. Whenever he doesn't get his way, he yells and begins hitting whatever or whoever is closest to him. Does this client have a mental health issue? Yes or no? Thank you! Yes! It does make a difference, right? If I'm talking about a 2-year-old, your answer would be different than if I'm talking about a 15-year-old or I'm talking about a 30-year-old, right? So where we are at in our environment and our development changes whether something is actually a mental illness or not. And I think this is really important because we tend to think that mental illness is all just one thing. And it really is shaped by our environment. And who we are, where we are, who is around us has all the difference in the world with whether or not this is a mental illness or not. So this forum is an overview of how our development and environment might affect our mental health. And I also want to acknowledge the impact that living through a worldwide pandemic has had on all of us. So I start with a quote from Karen McClintock. She writes, "Experts suggested that during the worst months of the pandemic, most of us started each day at about 30% arousal in fight, flight, or freeze, due to our body's natural inclination to protect us. Our bodies instinctually responded to fear by shutting down the frontal lobes of our brains, including the rationalizing, planning, and organizing systems." She continues, "It might be tempting to put those years of pandemic trauma into the past with relief and without examination or intentional repair. This would do a disservice to every person who died, every community unjustly impacted, and the nation at large." Now, I want you to stop just a minute and think about what she just said. So, when we are in fight, flight, or freeze, when we are in that space of arousal because of fear, right? What literally happens is that this back part of our brain right here recognizes that there's fear, and it shuts down the front part so that we have more energy, more resources to run, to fight, or to play dead if that's our instinct, right? It gives us all those resources to do those things by shutting down all of the parts that would keep us from doing that, right? It's a really, really good mechanism if you're facing, a tiger in the woods. Not quite so good when you're facing a pandemic and you can't get away from it. Right? So what happened is that for 2 years, all of us spent most of our time with that back part of our brain activated and the front part of our brain shut off to some extent. And so if you felt like you were kind of living through a fog, you were. And if it feels hard to kind of reactivate, it is. That's all normal. But I am going to talk about, because of that, as we go along, I will also talk about some trauma responses through the different ages. So we can kind of be aware if something is continuing and might want to take a look at it. Okay? Questions so far? All right. How am I doing? All right. So let's start with, let's see. Is this where I wanted to be? Okay. So, again, I told you it was going to be a really, technically developmental stages would be broken up into much smaller pieces. We're going to break them up into very large pieces. So we're going to start with childhood, which is a huge area and really should be broken up into about 3 or 4, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to go childhood up to about age 11 or possibly 12, depending on the development of the child. All right. Anybody guess, and I'm taking these from Erickson, who did some really good work on what our tasks are. What do we need to do to really feel whole and human at these different ages, right? And if we don't accomplish this task, was the other part of that, that's where we're going to start feeling at odds, where we're going to start feeling uncomfortable, discomfort. We're going to start getting into those realms of mental health issues, okay? So what tasks do you reckon a child up to about age 11 or 12 is needing? And the first one I'm going to give to you really easily because we hear it all the time. I'll do it myself at a certain young age. What task do you think that is? What need is being presented there? I'm sorry? Autonomy, that's right. Autonomy, or as Erickson would say, taking initiative. Excellent. And what's the other one as they get a little bit older? What is the most important task that they can do or that they're needing? About age 5, we send them to school because they need to learn, right? So, if those are the primary tasks at that age, where are we going to see the mental health issues show up? Remember, it's about your environment, it's about your development, so where are you most likely to see the mental health issues show up at this age? School. Thank you, whoever said that. Absolutely. So this is where this is the environment you're going to most likely see it show up. You may see some younger, but mostly it's going to show up in school. And what is the primary thing that is likely to show up in school? Any guesses? Parent-teacher conferences where they say something like, your kid really can't sit down. Your kid can't focus in class. Your kid is just constantly moving around and doing stuff. And part of you as a parent wants to say, well, isn't that what all kids do? Yes, it is. And if it gets to an extreme, it could be ADHD. It could be attention deficit disorder or something of that sort, right? So the main signs of that are just, like I said, being unable to sit still, especially in calm and quiet surroundings, constantly fidgeting, being unable to concentrate on tasks, excessive physical movement, excessive talking, being unable to wait their turn, acting without thinking, interrupting conversations. And again, I hope that you're listening to that list, all of you who have been parents or are parents, and thinking, but that sounds like being a kid. Again, mental health is both, right? There may be something that needs attention, and it might be just the environment. A change in environment may be all that's needed. And I want to emphasize that because so often we want to jump right to okay, this kid needs medication, this kid needs some change, and it may be all that they need is a change in environment, a change in the way that is being addressed in their life. And I promised I would point out the trauma places. All of those symptoms are also symptoms of trauma in young children. So if you have a kid in your life that is suddenly showing all of these symptoms, I would pay attention to the trauma before I paid attention to the potential ADHD or something similar. And in just a minute, I'm going to talk to you about one of the best things we can do to rewire trauma at any stage in our life. So hold tight. All of you who are thinking, okay, but now what? So a couple other things that we should watch for at this age are developmental disabilities, which can range anywhere from learning disabilities to autism spectrum. Again, it's going to start showing up in school because that's where we're expected to look a certain way and act a certain way. And that's where you're going to want to think about changing the environment. And then finally, the trauma symptoms that I just talked about. But additionally, you may also see regression, where they look like they're acting a lot younger than they've been acting. So you've got an 8-year-old, and all of a sudden they start acting like they're 4. And you're going, what's going on? That may be a response to the trauma, and that's where you would want to pay attention to that. Nightmares, difficulty eating or sleeping, physical aches and pains that don't seem to have any identifiable illness. I knew a kid once who started getting nauseated every single time she went to school. That's a sign of trauma. Right? It's not a sign of my kid, the kid really doesn't want to go to school because they're lazy. That's a sign of there's something traumatic happening at school, and so pay attention to that. All right, where to seek help. And this is where I hope you picked up your resource list in the back, because I'm going to highlight certain ones of them for you. If this is an age group that you're concerned about, if anything I just mentioned are things that kind of light bulb went off for you, Autism Spectrum, Rainbow Connection Family Resource Center. The website is there. Check them out. Different environment for school. We have some amazing, wonderful charter schools in this county. Charter schools are free. They are not private schools. They do not require big, expensive budgets. They get paid by the same dollars as the public schools, but they operate many times much like private schools, and they have all different kinds of focuses, right? And some of them are really, really good at handling kids that are showing a little bit more restless, having a hard time sitting down in class. They have different environments for that. Some of them are really good at dealing with other symptoms that just make it harder for a kid to be in a regular classroom. So do check it out. United Parents are really good at doing mentoring and respite care. And again, it's right there. And then there is mindfulness. And I promised you that I was going to show you something that is the one thing that is probably best at rewiring trauma in our brains, no matter what age we are. So here we go. You ready? We're going to do it. This is wonderful because it actually tells the back part of your brain that's all, upset and turned off the front, it tells it to turn off. It literally tells it to turn off and begins to rewire the parts of your brain that has gotten overactivated. So there's all different ways to do it, by the way. You can do it all sorts of ways. Today we're going to do it with breathing because it's easy and we all have air around us, and that is a good thing. So just start paying attention to your breathing. Make sure you're comfortable in your chair as much as you can be on a pew. Close your eyes if you're comfortable. And then notice your breathing as you inhale and exhale normally. Don't change anything, just notice it. Pay attention as it goes in and out. Can you feel the place where the air tickles your nostrils? Now pay attention to how the breath gently moves your body. Can you notice your belly or your chest moving as you breathe? Now sit for just a minute and pay attention to your gentle breathing. See how relaxed you can feel just sitting, breathing in and out. Whenever your mind starts to wander and think about something else, just gently guide your attention back to your breathing. How'd that feel? Yeah, I'm seeing lots of head nodding. The great thing is that can happen anywhere, at any time. It's easy to teach to your kids. On the resource list, I also listed a great YouTube channel for mindfulness activities, one called Be the Pond. So it's something you can actually show. If you have younger kids, you can show them. You can just have them watch, have them learn mindfulness at a very young age, and begin, like I said, to rewire that brain. All right. I was going to go through myths and reality checks on mental illness, and I think in interest of time, I'm going to skip it, but we do have a handout that's going to be there at the back. So do check that out, because I think it's important to remember some of those common myths that get told in our society about what mental illness is and isn't. And that's a good resource to kind of reground ourselves and in the realities of what mental illness is. All right, let's move on to adolescence. Everybody's favorite age, right? Show of hands, who wants to go back to being an adolescent? Amazing. Not really. All right, so from about 12 to around 18 or maybe even 25, depending on, your particular adolescent. Okay, all right. What are the developmental tasks at this age? Any guesses? Yes. Identity. In other words, I need to have my own identity separate from who my family is and who my parents are especially. All right, what else? Which can translate very well into this one, which is intimacy, right? Because I do really, really, really want to be the center of someone's attention, just maybe not my parents. This one I want to point out is particularly important as we think about who we are including in church, because this one is big for LGBTQ youth. So just kind of be doubly aware of those in your circle or in your environment or in your church who might be just coming into a reality about their orientation at this age, because they're at the same time seeking intimacy while being told that by much of society that that's impossible. So just be aware. All right, so what do we want to watch for? We want to watch for, at this age, hallucinations and substance use. All right, we're experimenting, trying to find our identity, but our brains are also developing in some really strange ways, right? And those two are not always related in the way we might think, right? We might think that the substance use comes first and the hallucinations come second, but often that is it is exactly the opposite. The substance use is the self-medication for the hallucinations. So don't assume which way that's going. We also want to watch for depression and irritability, and this is really hard when you're talking about adolescence, because has anybody ever known a teenager that wasn't depressed and irritable at some point in time? No. So how do we know the difference between whether it's something that is just normal and whether it is something that is we should really pay attention to? And the answer is length of time, right? If they show up one day and they are extremely depressed and irritable, and then the next day they are happy-go-lucky and going out with their friends, you may think that is a awesome sign of bipolar, and it's actually just normal. If, however, you find yourself going for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they are still depressed or they're still angry, and you're constantly walking on eggshells, you probably want to get to a therapist. Okay? Because it is normal at that age to be doing this. This is why not a single one of us said we wanted to go back to that age. It's miserable. But it is not normal to be down here all the time. Okay? Anxiety. Big one here you want to watch out for is body image, right? Eating disorders. So, kid is going along and they're suddenly, especially girls, but not only girls, but especially girls, they are suddenly not wanting to eat anything, and this goes on for a long time. Or you suddenly notice that they are losing a whole bunch of weight and there's no reason for it that you know about. Pay attention, that's a big one. And that is one that you should get help for immediately. Watch for the quality of attachments outside the family. Remember, identity is big. They want to develop their own identity. So this is normal. This is a good thing to watch for, right? If they've got attachments outside the family that are making you as a parent really, really frustrated because they don't want to be home anymore, be very grateful and thankful because they're probably developing perfectly normally and all is well in 10 years or so. If, on the other hand, they never go out anywhere and they can't tell you a single friend, that's when you want to get worried. That's when you should be paying attention. All right, symptoms of trauma at this age. So in traumatized youth, reminders of past traumas or losses can trigger a range of emotional behavioral problems, including hyperarousal, so what we were talking about before, that kind of constantly being on edge and up and irritable, right? Depression and irritability kind of go hand in hand with teenagers especially. Hypervigilance, so if they always jump when you show up behind them, they could be worried about what you might see, but they might very well be dealing with a symptom of trauma if it's every single time they jump when you're around. Avoidance, not wanting to talk about certain subjects. That does not include avoidance of you, by the way, as a parent. Numbing, so not feeling anything, not being able to kind of really feel, so they may just talk about not being able to, I just kind of flat all the time. Angry outbursts, back to that one, and substance craving. So again, that desire to find some way to kind of numb some of the feelings. All right. Any questions so far? Are you just writing them down? Okay, good. All right. So where to seek help? If you've heard some of those things and you're going, oh, okay, she said some of this was normal, but this sounds like it's more than normal. The National Alliance on Mental Illness has support groups and classes. Independent Living Resource Center, if they're a little bit older, and you do discover as you're working, through, you start working with a therapist, and you do discover there is an actual ongoing mental health issue, then they're a wonderful resource for how do you kind of move forward from here. How do you work on independence at that point? Diversity Collective, VC, Ventura-County Diversity Collective, is a great resource for those LGBTQ youths that I was talking about earlier. And don't forget the value of what you have right here, because one of the best things you can do for a teenager who is experiencing trauma is to connect them with a bunch of friends. Youth group. It is more than just a way to keep kids in church, right? It is actually its own support group. All right. Now, adults, middle years. This gets tricky when I'm putting ages up, so let's just call it working years, shall we? All right. What are the developmental tasks at this point? Any good guesses? What are you needing to do? Think back to, when you're just starting into trying to work and maybe you've, passed that intimacy development thing, so you actually have somebody in your life that you're working with. What are you trying to do? You got to provide and you got to figure out how to balance those two, right? So you have integration between home and life, which is a tough one for all of us. So integration, balance. All right, what else? We're going to get there in a little bit. Not quite yet. Right here, we're looking at transitions. We're looking at all the ways in which we need to move to kind of move. Oops. All right. There we go. Say again? We're building family. We're trying to figure out how that relates to our social relationships, how that relates to moving from the transition where power, was really important younger, and maybe as you get a little bit older, you start realizing that maybe wisdom is a little bit more important. Starting to try to figure out emotional and mental flexibility in all of this, because it's a balancing act, right? You're constantly balancing all of these different parts of your life and trying to figure out how to do that. So as you think about trying to balance all of these different parts of your life, what's the first thing that comes up for you in terms of mental response? Stress, thank you. I knew it would come. Anxiety, stress, right? So a certain part of that is just going to be normal during this part of life. And the other piece, when you can't feel like you can't quite get all the way there, if you think back to that fight, flight, or freeze model, this is really important, a really good way of thinking about it, right? So anxiety is the flight, right? It's like, I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to get if that doesn't work, then, and it just feels impossible, you might go into freeze, which looks a lot like depression, right? And anxiety, by the way, can go either way, right? It can go fight or flight, right? You can be running away and just keep running to different jobs or different things, or to try to keep up. You can get really, angry and irritable, which is, again, another side of depression, right? So you can get really angry and irritable and let the anxiety come out that way. Or you can freeze and just really go into a depression and start isolating and shutting off. Again, all of those are also symptoms of trauma, along with difficulty sleeping, irritability, hypersensitivity, an overall sense of numbness, and feeling overwhelmed or burnt out. So if you start feeling all of those, again, right now at the end of a pandemic, it's going to feel it's pretty normal, right? We're all going through some level of that. So how do you know when it's time to get help? When it starts affecting your functioning, right? Back to that environment. If you can't go to work anymore, it's affecting your functioning. If you're about to get fired because of feeling burnout all the time, it's affecting your functioning. If you and your significant other are constantly in a fight, it's affecting your functioning. If you can't see your friends anymore and it's affecting your social relationships, it's affecting your functioning, right? So if any of those things are happening, that's when you want to go, oh, I should seek some help. I should look for someone out there who can kind of help me process this a little bit. So where do you go? Well, if you were working and you were blessed to be working, and your employer has an employee assistance program, that's a great place to go. Start there. It's usually free. You can get at least 10 sessions often. Give it a try. Your insurance provider networks, for the most part, will offer a few sessions. If you need help finding a therapist, Psychology Today is a great resource just for looking for a therapist. You can see their bio, you can see what they're good at, you can see what they're interested in. That's a great place. I have included for you a little self-care handout. Sometimes that's the first place to start, is just, okay, I'm feeling some anxiety. How do I find ways to tell my brain that I'm okay, that I'm safe? And that can be as simple as just making sure that you have a routine and that you're including something that gives you joy, right? That can be as simple as doing a mindfulness exercise, like what we just did. It can also include something a little bit more complicated we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the automatic thought, and identifying that and questioning it. So we'll get to that in a second. The other side of the page is, what do we do once, it's not the anxiety, it's more the depression side of things. How do we reconnect with others? We can do it through ritual. Church is a wonderful place to do that, by the way. It's a place, especially if it's related to grief, which it often is, to name that, to bring it here, to send the person who died love, right? We can do all that here. It's a great place to talk about that with other people because there's a lot of other people who understand here. You can make a list of activities that you enjoy and just make a plan to do some of them. That gets you out of the house, gets you back into those interactions. You can take a walk, but take a walk in a way that actually allows you to see, so don't take the power walk. Take the walk where you look at all the flowers in the neighborhood, right? And then again, we're going to get to that automatic thought. So here we go. What are automatic thoughts and why do they matter? It's because our brains and our bodies work in very interesting ways, and that's a terrible triangle. My apologies. This is why I'm not an art major. All right, so we have our feelings, we have our actions, and we have our thoughts. Now, the interesting thing about this is that all of these influence each other, right? So if you're feeling something, it will probably make you think a certain way, and you'll probably do something differently with that, right? So I'm feeling sad, so I'm thinking nobody cares about me, and I just sit at home and don't do anything, right? See how that kind of works? Right? Which then, by the way, makes me feel more sad, which then makes me think nobody loves me, and I stay at home and don't do anything. So it goes in a cycle, right? The great news about this is that no matter where you interrupt that cycle, it also affects everything, right? This is why automatic thoughts are important, because if you can affect the thought, you're going to affect the feeling and you're going to affect the action. If you can affect the action, you're going to affect the feeling and the thought. Right? So if you notice that you're in this cycle, you can break it at any one of these points. So how does that work in reality? Somebody name a situation that might produce a small amount of stress for you. Any ideas? We don't want a big thing. We don't want to, delve into your life story here. Just something that kind of daily thing that might create some stress. Too much going on at once. All right, so you're juggling what? Name some things you might be juggling all at the same time.
Work, family.
All of those things we were just, yeah, exactly. Okay. What's the thought that goes along with that? What kind of automatic thoughts? And you guys can, help him out. He doesn't have to do all this himself. What kind of automatic thoughts might be happening at that moment? Am I doing it right? Thank you very much. Yes, exactly. What else? What am I missing? Oh my goodness, yes. What else? Okay, all right. Now, all of those probably have different feelings associated with them, right? But what feeling is associated with them is going to vary depending on your answer to the next questions. So you notice the feeling that's attached to the thought. Let's see. We'll use the last one. When is he coming home? Or when are they going to be home? Okay. What feeling might be attached to that thought? I can imagine several. Anger. Worry. Yep. Okay. We can start with those two. Those are very different, anger and worry. What's the difference? It's the same thought. It's the same situation. What's the difference between anger and worry there? Why the two different thoughts? Why the two different feelings? It's because of the meaning that we're ascribing to that thought, right? So the next question is, when is they going to be home, and why am I'm feeling this way? What meaning am I ascribing? What does that mean to me? Right? What does that mean to me that I don't know when they're home, when they're going to be home? And if that's true, what does that mean to me, right? And so you can question the thought in that way. And if you discover that the meaning that you're attributing to is like, I'm really afraid that they're gotten in a car accident on the way home, you can start questioning that thought, right? Because at that point, it's like, oh, okay, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that they might have gotten, how likely is that? What's the reality here? How likely is that they have gotten into an accident, or am I just reacting? Oh, well, probably not. It's possible, but it's probably not terribly likely. They usually get home safely, right? And at that point, what happens to our feeling? Any? You kind of, yeah, you invalidate the thought behind the feeling, right? We don't really invalidate, the feeling is appropriate, right? The feeling of concern and worry for our loved ones is a very appropriate feeling. But the thought behind it that's escalating that to this, oh my goodness, is probably not valid, right? Probably they are not going to get into a car accident, and there's no way we would know until it happens, So that's probably not a valid fear. So then we can invalidate the thought, which then changes our feeling. Does that kind of make sense so far? This is a really, really brief, but that's kind of how that works. And it can work in all, whether it's anxiety, whether it's fear, whether it's anger, whether it's depression. If you can identify that automatic thought and question it, you can often change the feeling, which is an amazing and wonderful thing about our brains. All right, last section. We are almost to make it through and be ready for your questions. We are ready for the elderly, which we are going to just define here, and don't anybody get mad at me. Since we defined this as the working adults, we're going to define this as the retired adults, although that's really, really problematic, but there we go. I don't know any other way to do that, so other than put ages, which I think might be worse. So here we go. All right, issues for the elderly. Developmentally, somebody earlier talked about making meaning. This is where that goes. That is the developmental task for the elderly, is making meaning of your life. Starting to begin to look through all of those working years and process when you didn't have time to process it during the time because you were balancing all of those things, right? So now you're taking the time to actually process it, to actually figure out, what did all that mean? What was I doing? Life review, absolutely. And then part of that then is accepting the past, accepting what has happened so far, and preparing the way for future generations. I loved this morning the stuffed animals. Talk about doing this task perfectly. That is preparing the way for future generations, providing for the next generation to grow up in a way that is loved and cared for. All right, what are the dangers at this age? Depression, right? Isolation is a huge, huge factor for depression. And So anything that limits seeing other people, I don't know, being shut in for 2 years, can also be caused, it can also be caused by disease, right? Not being able to get out because of diseases. It can be caused by medications that are used to treat high blood pressure, arthritis. There are multiple reasons, but that is probably the highest and the biggest thing to watch for. Loneliness is a huge, huge factor for depression, yes, and for the elderly. Right, yeah. And then there's the fear of being perceived as weak or a burden, right? So here we get back to that environment again, and how do we structure this so that as people get older, they don't feel like they are a burden to those around them, that they are loved and cared for, and they see that their gifts that they bring are valued. Where to seek help? Camarillo is incredibly blessed in this area because Camarillo has the healthcare district, which is an absolutely amazing resource for all things to do with caring for seniors and the elderly. Ventura-County Area on Agency, Ventura-County Area Agency on Aging, this is why they just refer to it as VCAAA, because you can't say it, is also a wonderful, wonderful resource with lots of different things, everything from legal aid options to help with understanding Medicare and how to sign up for it and what the different options are after you've signed up for it, and am I really getting what I need to have? So it's a great resource. The Alzheimer's Association. If you are starting to deal with any sort of dementia, do not wait, call immediately. Again, all of those links are on your resource sheet. So I would like to finish up on the dementia note with one of my favorite stories from one of my favorite resources for dementia. This one is Hiding the Stranger in the Mirror. A daughter would come to visit her mother, who lived in a nursing home. There was usually little conversation during the visits. The daughter would ask how the mother was doing, and the mother would say, "Fine, I guess." The daughter would ask, "Well, how are they treating you?" And the mother would say, "All right." After many long, awkward silences, the daughter would say she had to go, and then leave, feeling bad about having had another unproductive visit. Then the daughter talked with the activity director of the residence, and they came up with a plan. On her next visit, the daughter said, "Mom, tell me a story about when you were 4 years old." Now, one of the things that's important to notice here is that dementia works backwards. Right? And so asking her about when she was 4 years old is probably something she's going to remember quite well. The older woman thought a bit and with some prompting began to tell a story. The daughter wrote it down. Then the daughter said, "Mom, tell me a story about something I did when I was 4 years old." And the older woman thought a bit and then related a relevant story. And again, the daughter wrote it down. Using the principles that just described, and he talks about making sure that you're using font that's big enough for people to read. Because again, reading is one of the last things to go because it's one of the earliest things we learned. So even if they don't think they can read, they probably can if you just make it font that's big enough, right? So the daughter printed the stories that she had gathered from her mother. And then she gave them to her own 4-year-old granddaughter and asked her to illustrate the stories with crayon drawings. Next, she took her granddaughter to visit the child's great-grandmother in the nursing home. The older woman with dementia read the stories out loud to her great-granddaughter. Children love to hear family stories, especially about little children their own age. And when finished, the little girl asked her to read the stories again. This created a different kind of visit for the grown daughter and her mother, and it allowed the older woman to become the keeper of family history and the teller of stories. It allowed her grown daughter to have more enjoyable visits and a closer relationship with her mother. And it allowed the great-granddaughter to have pleasant visits as well, and to have a relationship with the older woman. The nursing home was neither scary nor boring to the child in this context. And I just love that story because, once again, it illustrates how a change in environment, a change in the way that the relationship was approached made all the difference between I can't visit and I can't talk to this person to this wonderful, amazing connection across generations. So with that, before we turn to questions, where did I put it? Oh, yes, two things. Okay, first of all, there is a handout in the back that I love about navigating faith with a mental health condition. Because faith, as we've kind of alluded to throughout, it can be a two-edged sword, right? The church, unfortunately, has not always done a good job. This church is doing amazing, and thank you, Pastor Julie, for doing that work, and the care team for doing that work of bringing this out and talking about it. But not all churches do that, and so sometimes there can be real stigma attached, and that can make navigating faith very difficult. So I love this handout for that reason. A couple other things. Under the tips, find a mental health professional that is willing to incorporate religious or spiritual approaches. That is my heart and my dream. So if you know somebody who's struggling with this, my card is in the back. I am also going to send around a sign-up sheet where you can ask for a follow-up consultation. If you want an individual consultation, do not list anything about the subject. I do want to honor your confidentiality. If you are looking for a group, that's the space to go ahead and just give me a really general idea. Nothing personal, nothing individual, but just a really general idea so that I can, if you're struggling more with anxiety, I'm not putting you in a group with people who are struggling with depression, okay? Just, kind of give me a very general, or I have a family member that I'm worried about, and you can put that there, and then I know it's more like a family group, right? So be very general, be conscious of, that it's being passed around, but if you would like a follow-up, that's what this is for. And now I think we are ready for questions.
Well, we've got a few questions to start with, and I am...
Okay.
Raise your hand, and I'll pick up in the others.
All right.
Keep writing questions. If you hear a question that sparks a thought in your mind, just raise up your card and pick them up.
All right. How do you know if someone needs to be hospitalized? Thank you for that question. When they are a danger to you or someone else. That would be my first and primary response. On the bottom of the handout, and thank you for this question because I meant to mention it. On the bottom of this handout is both the mental health crisis hotline, which, by the way, is new in California and across the nation. We now have a 988 number, which is much easier to remember than the super long suicide hotline number that we used to have, but it has the same function, does the same thing, except that it's expanded so that you can actually call for any mental health crisis, right? So if there is a sense that someone is to the point where they might be a danger to themselves or a danger to someone else, that is the number to call. There's also a youth crisis line specifically for California where you can text, which is great because, what youth do you know actually wants to pick up the phone and call? I don't. So texting is good. I think I also listed on your resource list some other, CalHope also has a text chat line, and so that's good. But if you feel like they're actually in danger, then pick up the phone and call 988 and get somebody on the line who can either talk them down from the crisis, which is our hope, because nobody wants to go to a hospital. But if they can't, they will get somebody there then to make sure that they're cared for and taken care of. Okay? Does that answer that question? All right. How do you find appropriate outpatient or inpatient mental health care? Ooh, I wish I had a good answer to that question in this county. I don't. The place I'm working at right now is starting to work on the answer to that question for youth, but we have nothing for adults. There's the psych hospital, and that's pretty much it. If anybody knows anything different, please say something, but that's what I know. I don't know of any good. So what you're going to do instead is they're probably going to go to, the emergency room, and if you as a loved one are going to want to be there right there with them, because you're going to need to advocate all along the way, every step of the way, that even that as they go to the psych hospital, if you feel like that's where they need to be, that you are advocating for what they actually need along the way, because we do not have a good system. And anybody who is, as you vote, as you talk to your, county supervisors, as you talk to your city, employees, as you talk, leadership, this we have to keep working on. If anybody is interested, the Episcopal Diocese has started a Commission on Gospel Justice, and we will gladly welcome Lutherans. So this is a passion of yours. Please talk to me afterwards. All right, let's see. Does a support group replace therapy? No, and sometimes. How's that for a very vague answer? Very Episcopalian answer. No, it does not, in that if you really need individual therapy, a support group is probably not going to replace it, but in a lot of cases, you may not actually need individual therapy. And because sometimes, support groups can do amazing things, especially in cases like depression, because remember, back to that triangle, one of the major symptoms, one of the major actions of depression is isolation. So being a part of a support group immediately works against that and interrupts that cycle. So support groups can do some really amazing things. The same thing with anxiety. It can really, that connection with others can really shift that whole pattern. So if you need an interruption to that cycle, a support group probably is one of the best things you can do. That said, you may talk to the support group leader and they may say, and I think that some individual therapy might also be helpful, and you should probably listen to that. All right. Can older adults overcome the trauma caused by events many years earlier? Wow, what a great question. Yes, and it's difficult. So we do know, and we are learning, and we're constantly, this is cutting edge right now, neuroscience, but we are learning that things like mindfulness do actually rewire the brain, and that can happen at any age, right? It's harder when you're older, right? There are important times when it's much easier, right? Little kids, their brains are already rewiring, right? So it's much easier to fix it at that stage. Teenagers, it's actually much easier to fix because they're rewiring, right? It's why it's so dangerous at that time period, because it can also go off track, but it can also, rewire in the right way with stability and care. But older people, yes, it absolutely, you can rewire that. It just is a little harder and takes a little longer because our brains take a little bit more work to rewire. All right. How does someone, I think this is ID, so how do you recognize it or find it on cutting? Wow, that's a big topic. Okay. So the signs, right, usually they're going to try to cover it up. So the signs would be wearing long sleeves in the middle of really hot weather. Spending a lot of time in the bathroom, and then maybe using bandages or lots of paper towels or things like that to kind of clean up afterwards. Sometimes you may not notice. The good news with cutting, if there is good news, the good news with cutting is that it is While it can be a warning sign for possible suicidal behavior later, so it is definitely something you want to take seriously if you see it, usually is not an immediate danger, because usually it is it's a coping mechanism. It's much more like substance use than it is like actually trying to permanently harm oneself. So if you think about it a little bit more like an addiction, that's a little bit closer to what it is. It's a way of trying to feel when you're completely numb. And so you're trying to transfer that feeling into your body, into physically feeling rather than the emotional feelings that you can't deal with in some way. If you realize that somebody in your life is cutting, that is definitely a time that I would seek out therapy, because it is a danger sign of some bigger things. But I also wouldn't panic at this stage. Just get a therapist. All right, marijuana use can lead to depression. How should this be approached? Wow, what age are we talking about? Because that really is. This is another one where this is really, really going to vary based on what age you're talking about, right? So, marijuana for somebody who is younger than 25 needs to be taken very seriously, because it can lead to worse mental health outcomes, right? It can rewire the brain at a time where the brain is very, very vulnerable because of all the changes that are going on, and so it can lead to, at worst case scenario, various psychosis, right? So you definitely want to intervene if it's a younger child, but you also want to pay attention to, are we experimenting and it's one time, or have they started, using an entire vape pen in one night, which is a whole different level, right? And stuff looking at me like, what are you doing? So you want to, again, I mean, if you're talking about a teenager, you want to be aware that some of that is going to be, experiment, and they got pressured into it by their friends, and you're gonna treat it as peer pressure, right? Versus somebody who is doing it on a regular basis because they need to numb something or they're self-medicating. So, if it's older person, yeah, the danger is not quite as high. But if it's actually leading to depression, or it's covering up the symptoms of depression, then you want to get the depression treated. And I would approach it that way. I would approach it more as treating the depression as opposed to treating the marijuana use, unless the marijuana use itself is creating a function problem. Like not being able to go to work, for instance. Fear. What are we doing? Okay. Child cannot sleep through the night, moves to a couch in your parents' room, won't go to basement or upstairs bathroom unless someone else is there. 9-year-old boy. Yeah, you're probably dealing with a little bit of trauma there. Not terribly surprising at this stage. I would get, not knowing the situation, thoroughly, I would guess that you're going to, I would watch it for a little while, right? If this has been going on for, because what I don't know from this card is how long this has been going on. If this has been going on for, 2 years, okay. That's different. Okay. You're dealing with this for 2 years. Yes, I would definitely get a therapist at this point. I would seek out individual therapy, individual help. If that's not an option, when you're dealing with fear, you want to do things that are going to tell that child that they're safe, right? How do you do that? You do that through very strict routines, right? Structure, structure, structure. You do that through, sometimes transitional objects can work, right? So what is a transitional object? A transitional object is something that, we used to have them all the time. It's the little blankie, right? That is actually a therapeutic object, right? It is a transitional object, right? It allows that fear and that need for safety to be transferred to something that can then be taken with. And yes, they're 9, and you may think a 9-year-old doesn't need that. Maybe they do. Remember the Linus cartoons? Maybe they do. And maybe you allow that for a little while in order to help them work through this. So, yeah, mindfulness, structure, transitional objects, and then listen, right? Every little thing. Watch their drawings. Look at their drawings. What are they drawing? What clues can you get from the things that they are saying or the things that they are drawing that might give you a tiny clue as to what it is that maybe started this fear? What are they trying to process, right? What death, what scary thing, what did they hear at some point during the past 2 years when we were all kind of in a fog that maybe their brain processed in a different way that went, I'm going to die, and how can you kind of calm that back down? So hopefully that's helpful. I have a family member with schizophrenia who refuses to get help. Wow, you guys weren't joking with these questions. Okay. Who refuses to get help. Are there agencies that reach out at the request of a family member, even if there is no event that affects the community? Not really. No. Unfortunately, that is one of the big gaps in our mental health system, is that we don't, until the person gets to the point where they are a danger to themselves or someone else, we aren't willing to do anything because we have this thing about, and on one hand I understand it, we have this really big thing about wanting, everybody to have their privacy and their individual autonomy, and on one level that's really great until you're the parent or the family member who is dying watching this young person and can't figure out a way to help. So I would say, the first thing I would say is seek support for yourself. That's where NAMI the National Association for Mental Illness, can be really, really helpful because they have peer groups for family members. And you can get support to talk about, well, what have you found? What have you been able to do? How did you work through this? Were there ways that you found to talk to your loved one that maybe made a difference? But at the very least, you have that support, you have that family, that support group that can kind of walk you through that, because that is such a horrible, horrible place to be in. I think I saw, were you wanting to comment or? No, okay. If you think a loved one has a mental health issue and needs a therapist, this is pretty much the same question. What are some ways to tell them, and how do you broach this topic? Gently. I would ask them what their goals are. My daughter and her friend are out there, so I'm waving at them. I would ask them what their goals are. What do they want out of life? What would a good life look for them? And then talk to them about the pros and cons of getting help, right? What are they, what's the pro of getting help? What's the con of getting help? What are they afraid of? What are they worried about? And then vice versa. What's the cons of not getting help? Right? Talk them through pros and cons, both sides. And hopefully in that process, as you're really listening to them, you can come to a solution that maybe they're really afraid of, they're going to end up being hospitalized. Maybe they're really afraid that the medication is going to make them feel like they're not themselves anymore. And as you talk and find out those fears, you may be able to kind of become their advocate and their ally and say, okay, well, if that's your fear, then I'll go with you to the psychiatrist if you want me to, and we'll talk about how to give you just enough medication to do what you want to do in life without feeling that way, or feeling that way as little as possible, right? And so you can begin to kind of work with them in that way. Silver bullet, it is not, but that's how I would approach it.
There's a good book called But I'm Not Sick, Dr. Amador.
Okay.
I don't remember his first name.
Okay.
And he's a psychiatrist, and his brother had schizophrenia. And he learned a new model through experience.
Mm-hmm.
I can just say it. I would recommend
Okay.
it. It was
Awesome. But I'm Not Sick by Dr. Amador.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. She said there's a wonderful book called But I'm Not Sick by Dr. Amador that I think you said his brother had schizophrenia. And so it's his kind of story of how he worked through that and learned a new way of kind of approaching that and dealing with that. So sounds like a very good resource. Yeah. Is autism spectrum disorder considered mental illness? Yes, because it is in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic, Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, but it is different than the other mental illnesses. It's basically, the better term for it is neurodiversity. What we're learning, is, as with, at one point homosexuality was in that manual too, right? Gender dysphoria, which is basically, having a different gender identity than what you were born with, is still in the manual, right? And part of that is because of insurance, right? If you don't have a diagnosis in the manual, if you don't have something that can be written down as a diagnosis, you often can't get insurance help, you can't get other support, you can't get all of that stuff. So yes, it is still in there for that reason, but what we are understanding is that it is a different way of the brain being wired, and once again, environment is everything, right? So if you have an environment that is conducive to that, it may not be a huge issue. If you have an environment that doesn't understand it at all and absolutely won't work with it, then yeah, it's going to feel an awful lot like a mental illness because you're constantly fighting everything in your environment. So yes, technically, and hopefully one of these days we will figure out a different way of doing these things. Last question. Ooh, okay. Define trauma, please. Oh, I am so sorry. I did not do a very good job of that, did I? Okay. Within the perspective of life happens kind of issues, is it just a matter of resilience? All right, so the technical definition of trauma is pretty severe. So it is when you have been around someone who died, tragically, violently, right? You are repeatedly exposed to violent actions or death for your work, for instance. So trauma is a major danger for, and traumatic disorders are a major danger for police officers, firefighters, the military, right? You yourself came very close to dying in a sudden, violent manner, right? Those are basically the technical definitions of trauma. Now, one of my questions, and I think we haven't answered it yet right now, because we're still trying to figure this out, is we just lived through a time period where all of us knew somebody who died unexpectedly or suddenly from a disease that suddenly came into the world that we hadn't ever seen before. So I am not entirely convinced, in fact, I'm pretty positive that all of us at some level are going through trauma, right? Now, whether trauma becomes a mental illness or not is a different question. That's the resilience question, right? So you can go through trauma and come out just fine based on your internal resources, right? And those internal resources are a whole list of vulnerability questions, right? Are you getting enough sleep at night? Literally, that's what. Are you getting good solid sleep at night? Are you eating do you have the right food to eat? Do you have people to talk to that you trust? How do you respond to adversity in your life? Did you learn as a child to kind of pick yourself up and keep going, or were you kind of taught to give in or expect things to be smooth for you? Right? Oddly, if you had a childhood of adversity, you may actually respond a little bit better to later traumas if you came through that okay. If you stayed vulnerable from that point, you're going to respond worse. If you came through it, if you worked through it, you may actually respond much better later on in life to trauma because you've learned that resilience. You've learned how to kind of pick yourself back up and how to reach out to other people. So it's a long answer to here's the technical definition, and how that looks at anyone's life, it really, really depends on everybody's individual environment and ways of responding. All right. Any others? Yes?
I have a question. Comparatively, is America leading edge, middle of the path compared to the world of mental health issues? Is it? I have a tendency to believe that we're in the middle or lower. I could be wrong.
I am not an expert on that, but from the bit I have seen and read, I would tend to agree with you. We're certainly not cutting edge. There are other countries that are doing stuff way beyond in terms of really understanding a lot of that environment piece and the ways in which we need to really actually proactively surround people with care when they're starting to go through something, as opposed to kind of pulling away and isolating them, and we're really bad at pulling away and isolating.
Well, Reverend Alene, thank you so much. I am impressed at how you fielded all of those questions, right? Wasn't that amazing? Yes, thank you. Thank you, yeah. Thank you all for being people who care enough about yourselves and loved ones to come out here today. Thank you to our care team who over a year ago did a health ministry survey of the congregation and noted that this is an important issue that people wanted to hear about. So thank you so much. I think you will be willing to mingle around a little bit. There are refreshments. So we want to be a caring community, and part of that is we get to know each other, we eat together, so there's another opportunity for snacks. Second one of the day. That's great. Yeah. So, and we'll just end with a prayer. If you could think of someone you love, and it can be yourself, I hope you love yourself, who may be struggling, who you may be worried about in terms of mental illness, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anything, and we're just hold them and all their mental health professionals up to God. Loving God, thank you for the helpers that you send to us. Thank you for Reverend Alene and her ministry. Please bless and protect our loved ones. Bless and protect us where we are suffering mentally or physically or spiritually. Shower us with hope and guidance. Lead us into life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you.